Behind the golden gates of Buckingham Palace, where centuries of tradition dictate every breath and every word, a storm was brewing that would shake the very foundations of the monarchy. It wasn't about politics, scandals, or international affairs. It was about family, rejection, and a decision so shocking that it left even the most seasoned palace staff speechless. When King Charles III ascended to the throne, the world expected changes. What no one anticipated was the moment he would look his wife's family directly in the eye and deliver words so cutting, so final, that the silence that followed would echo through the palace corridors for months to come. This is the story of how one conversation changed everything, how a king's refusal created rifts that may never heal, and how the woman who waited decades to become queen found herself caught between the man she loved and the family she cherished. The truth about what happened behind those closed doors has remained hidden until now. Palace insiders, bound by loyalty and fear, have finally broken their silence to reveal a story so dramatic, so filled with raw emotion and devastating consequences, that it reads like fiction. But every word is real, every moment documented, and every tear shed was witnessed by those brave enough to speak. This is not just another royal story. This is the untold truth about power, family, and the moment when King Charles made a decision that would haunt him forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Windsor Castle as King Charles III stood at his study window, watching the last of the wedding cleanup crews pack away the remnants of what many had called the most anticipated royal wedding of the decade. Just 3 months had passed since he and Camilla had exchanged vows in a ceremony that the world had watched with fascination, yet the joy of that day felt like a distant memory. Charles turned away from the window and glanced at the stack of correspondence on his mahogany desk. Letters from world leaders, invitations to state functions, and buried somewhere beneath it all, a handwritten note from Camilla's sister, Annabel Elliot. The note had been sitting there for 2 weeks, unopened, like a ticking time bomb that Charles wasn't ready to defuse. The relationship between Charles and Camilla's family had always been complicated. During their courtship years, when their love affair was conducted in shadows and whispered conversations, the Parker Bowles family had been protective, sometimes openly hostile toward the future king. They had watched their daughter and sister endure public humiliation, death threats, and character assassination, all for the love of a man who couldn't, or wouldn't, fully commit to her for decades. Mark Shand, Camilla's younger brother, had been particularly vocal during those dark years. A successful travel writer and conservationist, Mark had never hesitated to speak his mind about what he saw as Charles's selfish treatment of his sister. At family gatherings, he would make pointed comments about men who couldn't make up their minds, about the cruelty of keeping someone in emotional limbo for years. Charles knew about these comments, of course. Palace intelligence had a way of filtering back to the royal family, and Charles had endured many sleepless nights knowing that the people closest to the woman he loved viewed him as the villain in their story. But it was Annabel who had been the most protective. As Camilla's only sister and closest confidant, she had been the one to hold Camilla during her darkest moments, the one who had encouraged her to rebuild her life when it seemed Charles would never leave Diana, and the one who had celebrated the loudest when Charles finally proposed. Annabel had believed that marriage would change everything, that it would finally give her sister the respect and protection she deserved. The irony wasn't lost on Charles that now, as king, he was in a position to grant that very protection, yet he found himself more conflicted than ever about Camilla's family. The crown came with responsibilities that went far beyond personal relationships, and every decision had to be weighed against centuries of protocol, public opinion, and the delicate balance of constitutional monarchy. The trouble had started almost immediately after the coronation. Charles had been king for less than 6 months when the first incident occurred. Mark Shand had been invited to a state dinner honoring the president of South Africa, a gesture that Charles had approved as a way of showing respect for Camilla's family. But Mark, emboldened perhaps by his new proximity to power, had used the opportunity to corner several foreign dignitaries about wildlife conservation in Africa, essentially conducting his own parallel diplomacy. The Foreign Office had been furious. Sir Simon Case, the cabinet secretary, had requested an urgent meeting with Charles the next morning. "Your Majesty," Case had said, "is usually calm demeanor showing cracks of frustration. We cannot have family members conducting unauthorized diplomatic conversations. It undermines our carefully negotiated positions and confuses our international partners." Charles had defended Mark initially, arguing that his passion for conservation was admirable and that his expertise was genuine. But, privately, he had been deeply embarrassed. The incident had been reported in several international newspapers, with headlines questioning whether the new king could control his own family. The second incident had been worse. Annabelle's interior design company had been contracted to redecorate several rooms at Clarence's house, a job she had taken on with enthusiasm, seeing it as a way to support her sister's new role. But, when the invoices arrived, they were 3 times higher than originally quoted, and several of Annabelle's subcontractors had apparently been telling clients that they were working for the Queen to justify their own inflated prices. The master of the household, Sir Tony Johnstone Bird, had presented Charles with a detailed report of the expenses, his face a mask of professional neutrality that couldn't quite hide his disapproval. The original budget was £50,000, Your Majesty. The final cost was £167,000. There are also concerns about whether proper procurement procedures were followed. Charles had felt his stomach drop as he reviewed the invoices. Each line item felt like a betrayal of the trust he had placed in Annabelle, and, worse, he knew that every penny would be scrutinized by the media and the public. The royal family's finances were always under intense scrutiny, and any hint of favoritism or financial impropriety could become a major scandal. But it was the third incident that had pushed Charles to his breaking point. Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's son from her first marriage, had given an interview to a glossy magazine about life as a stepson to the king. The interview itself had been relatively harmless, focusing mostly on Tom's career as a food writer and his family life. But one comment had sent shockwaves through the palace. When asked about the differences between his life before and after his mother's marriage to Charles, Tom had said, "Well, the security is better now, and Mother doesn't have to worry about money anymore. Charles takes care of everything, which is how it should be. We're family now, and family looks after each other." The implication that Charles was financially supporting Camilla's adult children had been picked up by every major newspaper in the country. The Daily Mail had run a front-page story with the headline, "King's Stepson, Charles Pays Our Bills." The story had speculated about everything from private school fees for Tom's children to mortgage payments on family properties. Charles had been in Scotland when the story broke, attending a Highland Games event that had been planned for months. He had maintained his composure throughout the day, smiling and chatting with local dignitaries, but his private secretary had noticed the tension in his jaw, the way his hands had clenched whenever he thought no one was looking. The flight back to London had been tense. Charles had sat in silence for most of the journey, staring out at the clouds below while his team briefed him on the media reaction. The story had been picked up internationally, with American news outlets running pieces about the king's expensive new family, and European papers questioning whether British taxpayers were subsidizing the Parker Bowles lifestyle. Upon his return to the palace, Charles had requested an immediate meeting with his private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, and the Queen's private secretary, Sir Edward Young. The 3 men had gathered in Charles's study, the same room where he now stood, wrestling with the decision that would change everything. "The situation has become untenable," Charles had said, his voice carefully controlled but heavy with frustration. "Every interaction with Camilla's family becomes a potential scandal. Every gesture of goodwill is twisted into evidence of favoritism or financial impropriety." Sir Clive had nodded gravely. "The palace has always been clear that family members who are not working royals should maintain appropriate boundaries. The difficulty is that these boundaries have never been clearly established with the Parker Bowles family." Sir Edward had been more direct. "Your Majesty, the constitutional issues are significant. The monarchy's reputation for propriety and financial responsibility is fundamental to public support. These incidents are creating unnecessary vulnerabilities." Charles had walked to the window then, the same window where he now stood, and looked out at the gardens where tourists were taking photographs of the palace. Each of those tourists, he had realized, was a citizen whose taxes helped fund his lifestyle, whose support was essential for the monarchy's survival. Did they understand that becoming king meant sacrificing personal relationships for the greater good? Did they care that every decision he made was weighed against the needs of an institution that was bigger than any individual? The conversation with his advisors had continued for 2 hours, but the conclusion had been inevitable. Clear boundaries needed to be established with Camilla's family, boundaries that would protect both the monarchy and the individuals involved. But Charles knew that establishing those boundaries would mean disappointing people he had come to care about, people who had welcomed him into their family when his relationship with his own family had been strained. That night, Charles had barely slept. He had lain awake next to Camilla, listening to her steady breathing and wondering how he could explain to her that loving her might mean rejecting her family. The woman beside him had waited decades for him, had endured public humiliation and private heartbreak, and had finally achieved the recognition she deserved. How could he ask her to choose between her husband and her family? The next morning had brought another crisis. The Duchy of Cornwall office had received a call from a journalist at the Sunday Times asking about rumors that Mark Shand was using his connection to the royal family to secure funding for his conservation projects. The journalist had evidence of emails in which Mark had mentioned his relationship to the Queen when approaching potential donors, suggesting that contributions might provide access to royal patronage. Charles had felt the familiar knot in his stomach as his duchy secretary briefed him on the call. Even if Mark's intentions were good, even if his conservation work was legitimate and important, the appearance of using royal connections for personal gain was exactly the kind of scandal that could damage the monarchy's reputation irreparably. The walls felt like they were closing in. Every day brought new evidence that Camilla's family, with the best of intentions, was creating problems that Charles couldn't ignore. The weight of the crown, which had once felt symbolic, now felt crushingly real. He was no longer just Charles, a man who could choose to overlook family indiscretions for the sake of harmony. He was the King of England, and every decision had to serve the institution first, personal relationships second. Standing in his study that morning, 3 months after his wedding, Charles had finally picked up Annabelle's letter and torn it open. The contents had been exactly what he had feared, a warm, chatty update about family news, complete with casual mentions of royal events she was hoping to attend and suggestions for ways the family could support his reign. Reading between the lines, Charles could see the assumptions Annabelle was making about her new status, assumptions that he could no longer allow to continue unchallenged. The decision had crystallized in that moment. There would be a conversation, a difficult and painful conversation that would establish once and for all what role Camilla's family could and couldn't play in their new life. Charles knew it would hurt people he cared about, knew it would disappoint Camilla, and knew it might create rifts that would never heal. But he also knew it was necessary. The king had made his choice. Now he had to find the courage to act on it. Camilla had sensed the change in Charles long before he said anything. After decades of knowing him, she had become an expert at reading the subtle signs of his distress. The way he held his shoulders slightly higher when he was tense, the particular silence that fell over their breakfast conversations when something was troubling him, the restless energy that kept him pacing through their private apartments late into the evening. She had hoped it was merely the stress of adjusting to his new role as king. The transition from heir to monarch had been overwhelming for Charles, filled with new responsibilities, protocols, and pressures that even his lifetime of preparation hadn't fully equipped him to handle. But, as the days passed, Camilla began to suspect that something more specific was bothering her husband, something that involved her directly. The realization had come during a quiet Sunday morning at Highgrove, their country estate in Gloucestershire. Charles had been unusually quiet throughout breakfast, responding to her comments with distracted nods while his attention seemed focused on something beyond their conversation. When she suggested inviting Annabelle and her family for lunch the following weekend, Charles had hesitated in a way that made Camilla's stomach clench with sudden anxiety. "Perhaps we should keep things quiet for a while longer," he had said, not quite meeting her eyes. "The schedule has been so demanding lately." But Camilla knew Charles's schedule better than anyone, and she knew that the following weekend was deliberately kept free. She had also noticed that he had been avoiding her family's calls, leaving messages from Mark unreturned, and declining Tom's invitation to a food festival that Charles would normally have enjoyed. The pattern was becoming clear, and it filled Camilla with a creeping sense of dread. That evening, as they sat in the drawing room at Highgrove, Camilla had finally confronted the issue directly. "Charles, is there something you need to tell me about my family?" she had asked, setting down her book and turning to face him fully. Charles had looked up from the government papers he was reviewing, and, for a moment, his carefully composed expression had cracked, revealing the exhaustion and conflict beneath. "There have been some concerns raised," he had admitted slowly. "Nothing that can't be managed, but there are protocols and expectations that need to be clarified." The careful, diplomatic language had told Camilla everything she needed to know. In their private conversations, Charles spoke plainly and directly. When he retreated into formal, official language, it meant he was preparing to deliver news that neither of them would like. "What kind of concerns?" Camilla had pressed, though she suspected she already knew. She had heard the whispers among the palace staff, noticed the way certain conversations stopped when she entered a room, observed the slightly strained expressions of Charles's senior advisors when her family was mentioned. Charles had set aside his papers and taken her hands, a gesture that was both comforting and ominous. "Darling, you know how much I care about your family. Mark, Annabelle, Tom, Laura, they've all been wonderful to me, and I'm grateful for the way they've welcomed me into their lives. But the situation has become complicated." He had gone on to explain the incidents that had been building over the months, each one seeming minor in isolation, but creating a pattern that palace officials found deeply concerning. Camilla had listened in growing dismay as Charles outlined the diplomatic embarrassment caused by Mark's unauthorized conversations, the financial irregularities in Annabelle's renovation project, and the media attention generated by Tom's careless comments about royal financial support. "They don't understand," Camilla had said when Charles finished explaining. "They've never lived this life, never had to think about how every word and action is scrutinized and interpreted. They need guidance, not punishment." Charles had nodded sympathetically, but his response had revealed the impossible position he found himself in. "I know they mean well, and I know their intentions are good. But the advisors are clear that these incidents are creating unnecessary risks for the monarchy. They're asking me to establish clear boundaries before the situation becomes worse." The conversation had continued late into the night, with Camilla arguing passionately for her family, while Charles tried to explain the constitutional and political pressures he was facing. By the time they went to bed, nothing had been resolved, but both of them understood that a decision was inevitable. Over the following weeks, Camilla had tried to manage the situation herself. She had called Mark and asked him to be more careful about his public comments regarding conservation funding. She had spoken to Annabelle about the importance of transparency in any business dealings with royal properties. She had even had a difficult conversation with Tom about the need to avoid discussing family finances in interviews. But each conversation had been more painful than the last. Her family members had been confused and hurt by what they saw as sudden criticism for behavior that had seemed natural and harmless. Mark had been particularly wounded, pointing out that his conservation work was legitimate and important, and that he had never directly claimed royal endorsement. Annabelle had been defensive about her professional integrity, insisting that her renovation costs had been justified by the quality of work and the unique requirements of royal properties. The worst conversation had been with Tom, who had been genuinely bewildered by the media reaction to his interview. "I was just being honest," he had told his mother over lunch at her favorite restaurant in Mayfair. "I didn't say anything that wasn't true. Charles has been generous to our family, and I thought it was nice to acknowledge that." Camilla had tried to explain the complex dynamics of royal finances and public perception, but she could see that Tom didn't truly understand why his gratitude had become controversial. The innocence in his confusion had broken her heart, reminding her of how fundamentally different his world was from the one she had married into. Despite her efforts, the incidents had continued. A photographer had captured Mark leaving a meeting with potential donors, and the resulting photos had been published alongside speculation about whether he was leveraging royal connections for fundraising. Annabelle had been approached by a tabloid journalist asking about her increased income since her sister's marriage to the king. Even Laura, Camilla's daughter, had been drawn into the scrutiny when a gossip magazine published photos of her shopping in an expensive boutique, with caption speculation about who was funding her purchases. Each news story had felt like a fresh wound to Camilla, who found herself caught between loyalty to her family and understanding of Charles's position. She had lived through the media scrutiny before, during the years when her relationship with Charles was the subject of constant speculation and criticism. But this was different. Then, she had been the only target. Now, everyone she loved was being dragged into the spotlight, their words twisted and their actions questioned. The breaking point had come when Charles's private secretary had requested a formal meeting with Camilla to discuss family protocols. The very fact that such a meeting was deemed necessary had felt like a slap in the face to Camilla, who had spent years learning to navigate royal expectations and had believed she understood how to protect her family from the worst excesses of media attention. Sir Clive Alderton had been kind but firm during their conversation, explaining that the palace needed to establish clear guidelines about which family members could attend which events, what kinds of business relationships were acceptable, and how any public comments should be handled. The subtext had been clear. Camilla's family was being treated as a potential security risk rather than as valued relatives. "I understand your position," Camilla had told Sir Clive, her voice steady despite the turmoil she felt inside. But these are good people who love and support the monarchy. They don't deserve to be treated as problems to be managed. Sir Clive had nodded sympathetically, but his response had been devastating in its honesty. Ma'am, the difficulty is that good intentions are not sufficient to protect the reputation of the crown. Every association with the royal family carries weight and significance that extends far beyond personal relationships. The king's advisors have a responsibility to consider the broader implications of every connection and relationship. That night, Camilla had made a decision that would change the trajectory of everything that followed. Rather than continue to let the situation deteriorate through a series of bureaucratic restrictions and increasingly strained relationships, she would arrange for her entire family to meet with Charles directly. She would give them the opportunity to understand his position fully, and she would give Charles the chance to explain his concerns in person rather than through intermediaries. The invitation had been carefully worded, framed as a casual family dinner at Clarence's house. Mark, Annabelle, Tom, and Laura had all accepted eagerly, pleased to have an opportunity to spend time with Charles in a relaxed setting. None of them had suspected that this dinner would be anything more than a pleasant family gathering. Camilla had spent days planning the evening, choosing a menu that included everyone's favorite dishes and arranging for the conversation to flow naturally through topics that would allow Charles to raise his concerns without seeming accusatory. She had imagined a civilized discussion that would lead to mutual understanding and a collaborative approach to managing the challenges they were facing. But, as the evening approached, Camilla began to realize that her optimism might have been misplaced. Charles had been increasingly tense throughout the week, and his conversations with his advisors had become more frequent and more intense. The palace machinery was clearly pushing for a decisive resolution to what they saw as an ongoing problem. The morning of the dinner, Charles had received a briefing from the security services about potential threats related to the family's public profile. Although the threats were not considered credible, their existence had added another layer of urgency to the situation. The message was clear. Every day that boundaries remained unclear was another day of unnecessary risk for everyone involved. Standing in their private sitting room at Clarence's house, watching the staff make final preparations for the evening, Camilla had felt a growing sense of foreboding. She loved Charles deeply and understood the pressures he was facing, but she also loved her family and couldn't bear the thought of them being hurt or humiliated. Tonight, she feared one of those loves would have to give way to the other. The first guests arrived at 7 o'clock sharp, with Mark appearing at the door carrying a bottle of wine and his characteristic broad smile. He had been in good spirits lately, excited about a new conservation project in Kenya and pleased to have the opportunity to discuss it with Charles. As Camilla kissed her brother hello, she realized with a sinking heart that he had no idea what was coming. Annabelle arrived moments later, elegant as always, and carrying a small gift for Camilla, a beautifully bound book about garden design that she thought might interest her sister. Tom and Laura came together, having traveled from London, both of them relaxed and chatty about their recent activities. As the family gathered in the drawing room for drinks before dinner, the conversation was warm and natural, flowing easily between family news, current events, and shared memories. Charles was charming and attentive, asking about everyone's projects and interests with what seemed like genuine enthusiasm. To an outside observer, it would have appeared to be exactly what Camilla had hoped, a loving family enjoying each other's company. But Camilla could see the tension beneath Charles's polished exterior, the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes, the careful way he was steering the conversation away from any topics that might preview the difficult discussion to come. She could also see her family's complete obliviousness to the undercurrents in the room, their assumption that this gathering was simply a pleasant social occasion. As they moved into the dining room and took their seats around the polished mahogany table, Camilla felt as though she were watching a carefully choreographed performance moving toward its inevitable climax. The wine was poured, the first course was served, and the conversation continued its pleasant, superficial flow. But she knew that before the evening ended, everything would change. Charles was waiting for the right moment to begin the conversation that would shatter the illusion of this perfect family dinner. And when that moment came, Camilla knew there would be no going back. The dinner had proceeded through 3 courses with the kind of polished conversation that Camilla had grown accustomed to in royal settings. Charles had been the perfect host, asking thoughtful questions about Tom's latest cookbook project, praising Annabelle's recent interior design work for a National Trust property, and listening intently as Mark described his upcoming expedition to photograph endangered species in Madagascar. But beneath the surface pleasantries, Camilla could feel the tension building like a storm gathering force. It was during dessert, as the staff served individual chocolate soufflés accompanied by vintage port, that Charles finally began to steer the conversation toward the purpose of the evening. He had chosen his moment carefully, waiting until everyone was relaxed and the atmosphere was at its most convivial. I wanted to gather everyone tonight because there are some things we need to discuss as a family, Charles began, his voice maintaining its warm tone even as his words carried a subtle shift towards seriousness. The past few months have been an extraordinary time for all of us, with new roles and new responsibilities that affect everyone around this table. Mark, who had been regaling the table with stories about his conservation work, paused with his spoon halfway to his mouth. Something in Charles's tone had caught his attention, and Camilla could see her brother's expression shift from casual enjoyment to cautious attention. "Of course, Charles," Annabelle responded, setting down her dessert spoon and giving her brother-in-law her full attention. "We're all here to support you and Camilla in whatever way we can. This has been such an exciting time for our family." The word family hung in the air with particular weight, and Camilla noticed Charles's slight pause before he responded. She realized with growing dread that this moment was about to become the pivot point around which everything would turn. "That's exactly what I wanted to talk about," Charles said carefully. "The concept of family, and how it relates to my role as king and Camilla's role as queen consort. There are complexities and expectations that I don't think any of us fully anticipated." Tom looked confused, glancing between his mother and stepfather with the expression of someone who sensed that the conversation was heading in a direction he couldn't predict. "Is everything all right? Has something happened?" Charles took a deep breath, and Camilla could see him gathering himself for what came next. Despite all his years of diplomatic training and public speaking, this was clearly one of the most difficult conversations he had ever had to navigate. "Everything is fine," Charles assured him. "But there have been some situations that have raised concerns with my advisors and the palace staff. Situations that, however innocent in intention, have created complications for the monarchy." The word complications seemed to cut through the pleasant evening atmosphere like a knife. Camilla watched as her family members' expressions shifted from confusion to concern, their body language becoming more defensive as they began to understand that this was not the celebratory family gathering they had expected. Laura was the first to speak, her voice quiet but direct. "What kind of complications, Charles? Are we in some sort of trouble?" Charles's response was measured and diplomatic, but Camilla could hear the steel beneath his careful words. "Not trouble, exactly. But there have been incidents where family connections to the royal household have been misunderstood or misrepresented in ways that could be damaging to the crown." He began to outline the specific situations that had caused concern, speaking with the detached professionalism of a king rather than the warmth of a family member. The unauthorized diplomatic conversations at state functions, the financial irregularities and inflated costs in business dealings with royal properties, the public comments about royal financial support that had generated unwanted media attention. As Charles spoke, Camilla watched her family's faces transform from confusion to hurt to anger. She could see Mark's jaw tightening as Charles described his conservation fundraising efforts as potentially inappropriate leveraging of royal connections. She watched Annabelle's face flush with indignation as Charles suggested that her renovation invoices had created unnecessary financial scrutiny for the royal household. But it was Tom's reaction that broke Camilla's heart. Her son listened with growing dismay as Charles explained how his innocent comments about family financial support had been twisted into a major media story about royal favoritism. The hurt and bewilderment in Tom's eyes reminded Camilla of the little boy he had once been, confused by adult complications that seemed to make no sense. "I don't understand," Tom said when Charles finished his recitation of concerns. "I never meant to cause problems. I was just being honest about how grateful our family is for the way you've welcomed us into your life." Charles's response was kind but devastating in its implications. "I know your intentions were good, Tom. All of your intentions have been good. But intention isn't enough to protect the reputation and stability of the monarchy. Every word spoken by anyone connected to the royal family carries weight and significance that extends far beyond personal relationships." Mark had been silent during most of Charles's explanation, but now he leaned forward with the intensity that Camilla recognized from their childhood, The look he got when he was about to say something that would change everything. So what exactly are you telling us, Charles? Mark's voice was controlled, but Camilla could hear the anger building beneath the surface. Are you saying that our natural family relationships are now a threat to your throne? The directness of the question seemed to catch Charles off guard, and, for a moment, his diplomatic composure slipped. I'm saying that there need to be clear boundaries and expectations so that we can protect both the monarchy and your own interests. The scrutiny that comes with royal connections can be overwhelming and destructive if it's not carefully managed. Annabelle, who had been growing increasingly agitated as the conversation continued, finally exploded with the frustration that had been building. Managed? You want to manage our family relationships like some sort of business arrangement? Her voice carried the accumulated hurt of months of whispered criticisms and bureaucratic restrictions, the pain of watching her sister's happiness become clouded by institutional pressures that none of them had fully understood. I've spent my entire career building a reputation for integrity and professionalism, Annabelle continued, her voice rising despite the formal setting. I've never traded on family connections, never used Camilla's position to gain advantages. But now you're suggesting that my work, my livelihood, my professional reputation are somehow compromised because I happen to be the Queen's sister. Charles tried to respond with his usual diplomatic calm, but the raw emotion in the room was making it impossible to maintain the polished political language he typically employed. Annabelle, please try to understand. This isn't about questioning your integrity or your professionalism. This is about protecting all of us from situations that can spiral beyond our control. But Mark wasn't finished. The travel writer and conservationist who had spent years advocating for environmental causes in some of the world's most challenging political environments was not going to be intimidated by royal protocol or diplomatic niceties. Protect us. Mark's voice was incredulous. Or protect yourself. Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you're asking us to pretend we're not family so that your advisors don't have to worry about managing the politics of having actual human relationships. The accusation hit Charles like a physical blow, and Camilla could see him struggling to maintain his composure in the face of such a direct challenge to his motives. She knew that Mark's words had found their target because they contained a grain of truth that Charles couldn't entirely deny. That's not fair, Mark, Charles responded, his voice tight with controlled emotion. You know how much I care about this family. But I also have responsibilities that extend beyond personal relationships. The monarchy serves the entire nation, and I can't allow personal considerations to compromise that service. Laura, who had been silent throughout most of the exchange, finally spoke up with the quiet intensity that Camilla recognized as her most dangerous mood. So where does that leave us, Charles? Are we supposed to pretend we don't know you? Are we supposed to hide our relationship with our own family? The questions hung in the air like accusations, and Camilla could see Charles struggling to find a response that would somehow satisfy both his institutional responsibilities and his personal relationships. But she was beginning to realize that no such response existed, that the conversation had moved beyond the possibility of compromise or middle ground. What I'm asking for, Charles said slowly, is for everyone to be more conscious of how their actions and words might be interpreted in the context of royal connections. There need to be clearer boundaries around business relationships, public comments, and social activities. Tom, who had been listening to this exchange with growing distress, finally asked the question that everyone was thinking but no one wanted to voice. Are you saying you don't want us in your life anymore? The innocence and pain in the question seemed to break something in Charles, and, for a moment, his carefully maintained royal composure cracked completely. Camilla could see the anguish in his face as he struggled to explain a position that even he wasn't entirely comfortable with. No, Charles said quietly, I'm not saying that. But I am saying that our relationships need to change. They need to be more carefully managed and more clearly defined to protect everyone involved. But Mark wasn't willing to accept such a diplomatic non-answer. That's exactly what you're saying, though, isn't it? You're saying that our family relationships are now subordinate to your political needs. You're asking us to choose between being ourselves and being acceptable to your advisors. The challenge was direct and brutal, cutting through all the polite language and diplomatic evasions to the heart of what was really happening. Charles was being forced to choose between his personal relationships and his institutional responsibilities, and he was asking Camilla's family to accept the consequences of that choice. Charles's response, when it came, would change everything. And Camilla, sitting between the man she loved and the family she cherished, knew that whatever he said next would determine the future of all their relationships. The silence stretched on, heavy with expectation and dread, until Charles finally spoke the words that would echo through the palace corridors for months to come. Charles stood up from the dinner table with the deliberate movements of a man who had reached a point of no return. The crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier above, casting small rainbows across the white tablecloth as he moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that palace staff had learned to recognize as a sign of momentous decision. The silence in the dining room was absolute. Even the distant sounds of London traffic seemed muted, as if the entire world was holding its breath for what would come next. Camilla felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched her husband gather himself for words that she knew would change their lives forever. When Charles turned back to face the table, his transformation was complete. Gone was the indulgent brother-in-law and stepfather who had charmed them through dinner. In his place stood the King of England, with all the weight and authority that the title carried. "I need you to understand something," Charles began, his voice carrying a formality that made even the familiar dining room feel suddenly cold and vast. "When I became king, I didn't just inherit a title. I inherited a responsibility that extends to every person in this kingdom and to the institution of monarchy itself. Every decision I make, every relationship I maintain, every word I speak must serve that responsibility first." Mark started to interrupt, but Charles raised a hand in a gesture that was unmistakably regal, a movement so natural and commanding that it stopped all conversation instantly. "Please, let me finish," Charles continued, his tone brooking no argument. "I've spent months trying to find a way to balance my personal affections with my constitutional duties. I've consulted with advisors, studied precedents, and explored every possible compromise. But the conclusion is unavoidable." He paused, looking directly at each family member in turn, his gaze lingering longest on Camilla, who sat frozen in her chair with dawning horror at what she was hearing. The Parker Bowles family's continued close association with the royal household has become a liability that I can no longer ignore or manage. The incidents of recent months have demonstrated that good intentions are not sufficient to prevent damaging consequences for the monarchy. Annabelle gasped audibly, her hand flying to her throat as if she had been physically struck. "Charles, you can't be serious. We're not strangers off the street. We're Camilla's family." "Yes," Charles replied with devastating, quiet certainty, "and that relationship is precisely the problem. Your family connections to the Queen Consort create expectations and assumptions that put you under scrutiny that none of you asked for and that you're not equipped to handle. More importantly, they create vulnerabilities for the crown that I cannot allow to continue." Tom's face had gone pale, his usual confidence replaced by the bewildered hurt of someone who had just discovered that the ground beneath his feet was not as solid as he had believed. "But we love you," he said quietly, the simple statement carrying more weight than any elaborate argument. Charles's composure flickered for just a moment, revealing the pain that his royal mask was designed to hide. "I know you do, and I care about all of you deeply. But love is not enough to overcome the realities of constitutional monarchy. The crown must be above reproach, beyond question, immune to the kinds of scandals and controversies that destroy public confidence." Laura, who had been silent throughout most of the evening, finally spoke with the direct honesty that Camilla had always admired in her daughter. "So what are you actually saying, Charles? Are you banishing us from your life?" The word banishing seemed to hang in the air like an accusation, and Charles flinched slightly before responding. "I'm saying that going forward, there must be clear and non-negotiable boundaries. No more business dealings with royal properties. No more attendance at state functions or official events. No more public comments about royal family matters or finances. No more leveraging of royal connections for professional or personal gain." Mark's chair scraped against the floor as he pushed back from the table, his face dark with anger. "And if we don't agree to these boundaries, what then?" Charles's answer was delivered with the cold finality of a judicial sentence. "Then you will be formally excluded from all royal functions and properties. All business relationships will be terminated immediately. All security protections will be withdrawn. And any future attempts to trade on royal connections will be met with legal action." The threat was unmistakable, delivered with a precision that revealed just how thoroughly Charles and his advisors had planned this confrontation. This was not an emotional outburst or a spur-of-the-moment decision. This was a calculated political maneuver designed to protect the monarchy at any cost. Camilla found her voice for the first time since the conversation had turned serious, her words coming out as barely more than a whisper. Charles, they're my family. They're the people who loved me before I was queen, who supported me through all the difficult years. You can't ask me to choose between them and you. But Charles's response revealed that he had already made that choice for her. I'm not asking you to choose, darling. I'm telling you what the choice has to be. The crown comes first. It has to come first, or it ceases to exist. The formality of his language, the way he called her darling, even as he delivered this devastating ultimatum, revealed the terrible cost of his position. Charles was not just rejecting Camilla's family. He was rejecting a fundamental part of who she was, the relationships that had shaped her and supported her throughout her life. Mark stood up abruptly, throwing his napkin down on the table with a gesture that was both defiant and heartbroken. Well, then, I suppose we know where we stand, don't we? Blood may be thicker than water, but apparently it's not thicker than crown jewels. His words carried the bitter pain of someone who had believed that love and loyalty mattered more than politics and protocol. The man who had defended wildlife against poachers and governments, who had faced down corrupt officials and dangerous criminals in his conservation work, was being defeated by the cold calculations of constitutional monarchy. Don't make this about greed or ambition, Mark, Charles replied, his voice showing the first signs of real emotion since he had begun his formal pronouncement. This is about survival. The monarchy survives by maintaining the confidence of the British people. That confidence is fragile, and it can be destroyed by scandals and controversies that seem insignificant to those involved, but loom large in public perception. Annabelle, who had been sitting in stunned silence, finally found her voice, though it shook with suppressed tears. So our crime is loving Camilla too much? Our punishment is losing the sister who means everything to us. The question struck at the heart of the impossible position Charles had created. He was asking Camilla's family to accept their own exile in order to protect the institution that had given their sister everything she had ever wanted. The cruel irony was that their love for Camilla was both the reason for their inclusion and the justification for their exclusion. Your crime, Charles said with painful honesty, is being human in a system that requires perfection. Your punishment is the same as mine, sacrificing personal happiness for institutional necessity. Tom, who had been struggling to understand the conversation's implications, finally grasped the full scope of what was happening. You're saying that we can't be a family anymore. Not really. We can't share holidays or celebrations or just spend time together without it becoming a political calculation. Charles's nod was barely perceptible, but it confirmed Tom's worst fears. The spontaneous family gatherings, the casual dinners, the birthday celebrations, and Christmas mornings, all of it would now be filtered through the requirements of royal protocol and political necessity. But what about Camilla? Laura demanded, her voice rising with desperate intensity. What about what she wants? Doesn't she get a say in whether she sacrifices her family for your crown? All eyes turned to Camilla, who sat pale and silent at the head of the table, caught between competing loyalties that were tearing her apart. She looked from her husband to her family and back again, searching for words that could somehow bridge the impossible gap that had opened between them. I love you all, she said finally, her voice breaking with the weight of emotions she could no longer contain. I love Charles, and I love my family, and I don't know how to choose between you. But I also know that Charles is right about the pressures we're facing. The scrutiny is relentless, and every mistake is magnified until it becomes a crisis. Her admission that Charles was right felt like a betrayal to her family, while her obvious pain at having to make such a choice revealed the terrible cost of royal life. Camilla had waited decades to marry the man she loved, only to discover that the price of that marriage might be the loss of everyone else who mattered to her. Mark's response was quiet, but devastating. Then, I suppose the royal family has gained a queen and lost a sister. He moved toward the door with the dignity of someone who refused to be broken by circumstances beyond his control. But, before he left, he turned back to face Charles directly. I hope the crown you're protecting so carefully is worth what you're destroying to keep it, Mark said, his words carrying the weight of prophecy. Because what you're doing tonight isn't protecting the monarchy. You're revealing exactly what it costs to maintain it. As the family members filed out of the dining room one by one, each carrying their own burden of hurt and betrayal, Camilla remained seated at the table, staring at the remains of what should have been a celebration of their new life together. The silence that followed their departure was not the comfortable quiet of satisfied conversation, but the hollow emptiness of relationships severed and trust destroyed. Charles stood alone by the window, his shoulders bearing the weight of decisions that would haunt him for the rest of his reign. He had protected the monarchy, preserved its dignity, and maintained its political stability. But, in doing so, he had paid a price that even he was only beginning to understand. 6 months had passed since that devastating dinner at Clarence House, and the silence that had followed Mark Parker Bowles out the door had settled over the royal household like a permanent shroud. The palace functioned with its usual precision. State visits proceeded according to protocol, and official engagements continued their relentless schedule. But those who worked closest to the king and queen consort could sense the profound change that had taken place. Camilla had thrown herself into her royal duties with an intensity that surprised even her most dedicated staff members. Her calendar was packed with charity visits, patronage events, and public appearances that kept her occupied from dawn until late evening. But her personal staff noticed the way she avoided her private sitting room, where family photographs still stood on the side tables, and how she had stopped mentioning upcoming family celebrations that would never again include the people who had shaped her life. The queen consort's public appearances maintained their warmth and accessibility, but those who had worked with her for years observed a subtle withdrawal, a protective shell that hadn't been there before. During charity visits to children's hospitals, she would pause at the family photographs that decorated young patients' bedside tables, her expression growing distant as she processed scenes of uncomplicated family love that had become foreign to her own experience. Charles, meanwhile, had developed an almost compulsive focus on his constitutional duties. He studied briefing papers with unprecedented attention to detail, requested additional meetings with government ministers, and threw himself into the mechanical aspects of kingship with a dedication that bordered on obsession. His staff recognized this behavior as a form of emotional armor, a way of avoiding the personal costs of the decisions he had made. The king's sleep had become irregular, with palace staff noting lights in his study burning well past midnight as he worked through correspondence that could easily have waited until morning. During his morning walks through the gardens at Buckingham Palace, Charles often stopped at the spots where he and Camilla had once discussed family plans and future gatherings, his expression revealing the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. The practical consequences of Charles's ultimatum had unfolded with bureaucratic efficiency that made them feel even more brutal. Annabel Elliott's interior design company had been formally removed from the list of approved contractors for royal properties, a decision that had cost her several prestigious projects and damaged her professional reputation. The official explanation cited streamlining procurement procedures, but everyone in the industry understood the real message. Association with the Parker Bowles name was now a professional liability. Mark Shand had continued his conservation work, but funding had become more difficult as potential donors worried about the political implications of supporting someone who had been effectively exiled from royal circles. His planned expedition to Madagascar had been postponed indefinitely due to lack of financial backing, and several conservation organizations had quietly distanced themselves from his projects to avoid any appearance of royal controversy. Tom Parker Bowles had perhaps suffered the most visible consequences. Publishers had become reluctant to offer him cookbook contracts, worried that his royal connections might overshadow his culinary expertise and create unwanted media attention. Food festivals that had once eagerly sought his participation now hesitated to extend invitations, uncertain about the protocol implications of associating with the queen consort's estranged son. Laura Lopez had retreated almost entirely from public life, declining social invitations and avoiding events where she might encounter journalists or photographers. The art gallery where she worked had suggested she take an extended leave of absence to allow the media attention around her family situation to die down, effectively ending a career she had built independently of any royal connections. The media had sensed the story without understanding its full scope. Gossip columns noted the absence of Camilla's family members from recent royal events, and society photographers complained about the difficulty of capturing the informal family moments that had once provided some of their most popular images. But the palace's wall of silence had held firm, with official spokespeople deflecting questions about family dynamics with practiced diplomatic non-answers. Behind that wall of silence, however, the emotional cost was becoming increasingly apparent. Palace staff had observed that Charles and Camilla rarely spent time together outside of official functions, their conversations limited to necessary coordination about schedules and public appearances. The easy intimacy that had once characterized their relationship had been replaced by a formal politeness that felt more appropriate to diplomatic partners than to husband and wife. The Queen Mother's former staff, who had served through decades of royal family crises, recognized the pattern of behavior that emerged when personal relationships became subordinate to institutional requirements. They had seen it during the abdication crisis, during the breakdown of Charles's first marriage, and during various scandals that had tested the monarchy's resilience. The institution survived by sacrificing individuals, and those sacrifices left permanent scars on everyone involved. Dr. Sarah Bradford, the royal biographer who had written extensively about the modern monarchy, later observed that Charles's decision represented a fundamental shift in how the royal family managed personal relationships. Previous generations had found ways to incorporate extended family members into royal life while maintaining appropriate boundaries. Charles's approach represented a complete severing of ties that reflected both his personal rigidity and the increasingly precarious position of the modern monarchy. The decision's impact on Charles personally became evident in his increasingly isolated lifestyle. Courtiers noted that the king rarely entertained private guests anymore, limiting his social interactions to official functions and constitutional duties. The man who had once enjoyed hosting intimate dinner parties and casual country weekends had effectively withdrawn from the personal relationships that had once sustained him. Camilla's isolation was perhaps even more profound. As queen consort, she was surrounded by staff and officials who treated her with appropriate deference, but she had lost access to the honest, unfiltered relationships that had grounded her throughout her life. Her family had been the people who could tell her uncomfortable truths, challenge her decisions, and remind her of who she was beyond her royal title. The palace's Christmas celebrations that year had been particularly stark, with official photographs showing Charles and Camilla surrounded by working royals and senior staff, but notably absent of the warm family scenes that had characterized previous holidays. The formal dignity of the images couldn't disguise the emotional emptiness they represented. Foreign diplomats who had known Charles during his years as Prince of Wales observed a fundamental change in his demeanor during state visits and official functions. The man who had once been genuinely curious about other people's lives and experiences had become more guarded, his conversations limited to safe topics that couldn't lead to personal revelations or emotional vulnerability. Queen Camilla's patronage work, while professionally successful, had lost the spontaneous warmth that had once made her so effective with charitable organizations. Her interactions with beneficiaries and volunteers remained kind and appropriate, but lacked the genuine emotional connection that had distinguished her from other members of the royal family. The long-term implications of Charles's decision began to extend beyond immediate family relationships. Other members of the extended royal family started to question their own positions and relationships, wondering whether their continued association with the monarchy might eventually be seen as problematic. The message was clear: loyalty to the institution required the subordination of all personal considerations. Palace historians noted that Charles's reign was establishing precedents that would influence the monarchy for generations to come. Future kings and queens would inherit not just constitutional responsibilities, but also the expectation that personal relationships must always be secondary to institutional requirements. The human cost of this approach was becoming evident, but the constitutional benefits remained theoretical. As winter turned to spring, the silence that had settled over Charles and Camilla's personal lives showed no signs of lifting. Letters from family members went unanswered, birthday invitations were declined through private secretaries, and holiday traditions that had sustained relationships for decades were quietly abandoned. The king who had waited so long to wear the crown had discovered that its weight was measured not just in gold and jewels, but in the relationships sacrificed to maintain its dignity. The silence that followed his decision had indeed shaken the palace forever, but whether it had strengthened or damaged the monarchy would only become clear with time. In her private moments, Camilla sometimes stood at the windows of her apartments, looking out at the London streets where ordinary families went about their lives without considering the political implications of loving each other. The crown she had waited so long to wear had given her everything she had dreamed of, except the simple freedom to maintain the relationships that had made her who she was. Charles, meanwhile, continued to fulfill his constitutional duties with the dedication that his advisors had demanded, but those closest to him could see that something essential had been lost in the process. The King of England had protected his throne by sacrificing his heart, The silence that followed would echo through the corridors of power for the remainder of his reign.